And I would now like to invite Mrs. Squire to tell a story about her mother.
Pastor Chris, distinguished pastors, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Regina Pogorski-Skyer. Yesterday, my mother, Ruth Pogorski, turned 90 years old. Her mind is clear, but her health is frail, so she could not make the trip to be with you today. Last year, at another celebration, I made a pledge to my mother at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan that when she was no longer able to tell her story, that I would do so to continue in our family history. So I will speak in my mother's voice, and we will travel together back in time to the year 1926. My name is Ruth, and I was born in Berlin, Germany in 1926, only 14 months after my beloved brother, Benjamin. Benjamin was my best friend. I spent every day of my life with him until he was dragged away from us by the Nazis when he was 17 years old. Before the Holocaust, we were a happy and prosperous family. My father, Joshua, was a successful businessman. He imported Persian rugs and had 39 warehouses on the Baltic Sea coast and customers from around the world. My mother, Regina, was a homemaker. We were a religious family. We took pride in our Jewish heritage. My father was president of his synagogue and sat next to a rabbi. My parents were generous and charitable, never forgetting to care for those less fortunate than themselves. Every summer, we spent our holidays in the little farming town where my grandparents lived, in Poland, called Justic. Oh, how I loved those summers. And then suddenly, in January 1933, our life turned upside down. Hitler was appointed chancellor and absolute ruler of Germany. My parents were in disbelief. How could this happen in their beloved country, where so many Jews had fought and died in World War I? I remember Father saying, "Don't worry, this too will pass." But it didn't pass. And in 1935, the German government issued the Nuremberg laws, which robbed Jews of all their civil rights. We could no longer go to public schools. Jewish doctors could no longer see non-Jewish patients. Jews could not work as civil servants. And a new law prohibited Jews from owning businesses. A year later, my father was confronted by one of his warehouse managers, who demanded that he turn the entire business over to him. Instead, my father fired him on the spot. 2 weeks later, my father was arrested by the SS Nazi officers. He was interrogated, brutally beaten, and sent to Dachau concentration camp. My family knew nothing of this. We believed he was away on a business trip. Soon afterwards, a parcel arrived at our home, addressed to me. I was sure it was a gift my father was sending, as he often did this. I eagerly opened the box, and inside was his blood-soaked clothing and a note pinned on it, "Juden raus, Jews out." We were in disbelief. Only 2 days later, a Nazi officer came to our home with an eviction notice. "Frau Wachner," he said to my terrified mother, "you have 48 hours to leave Germany. Your bank accounts are frozen. You can only take what you can carry." And so in May 1936, we were taken and dumped on a train to Poland. There was no other country in the world that would take us in. We had no papers. We went to Katowice, a Polish city not far from the German border, where my aunt and uncle lived. All this time, my mother's brothers worked on getting him released from Dachau concentration camp. After paying large bribes, they finally managed this. Once Papi was back with us, we moved to our own apartment, and he established yet another business, and he was prosperous, because in spite of all, he was a brilliant businessman. We lived in Poland for 3 years, praying that Hitler would not turn into the foul monster that he did. People often ask me, "Why didn't you leave?" But there was no country that wanted Jews. We had no place to go. There was no state of Israel. The storm clouds of war were gathering all over Europe. At the end of August 1939, I became very ill with rheumatic fever. I almost died. And then I remember it like it was yesterday. On September 1st, 1939, we were awakened at 5 a.m. in the morning by the sound of wailing sirens. The war had begun. Germany declared war on Poland. I was too sick to go into the shelters, so we all huddled in my parents' bed and we prayed. The house next to ours was hit, yet we survived. The tragic irony was that my brother was to leave to go to school in England. Had the war only started 4 days later, he would have made it. On September 2nd, the Polish militia drafted my father and his car into their army. My uncles brought a horse and cart. We knew we had to leave Katowice. We knew we had to go to family, because family above all means safety. I rode on top of this cart while my family walked alongside. You can only imagine the roads. People were running in panic. Old people were in wheelbarrows carrying small children. People were screaming. There were no shelters. After traveling for 2 days, we made it to the city of Krakow in Poland. And we went straight to a children's hospital which was run by nuns. I was very sick, and my mother begged the nuns to please admit me. The nuns refused. "We have no room for Jewish children." My mother stood outside this hospital and cried. It was getting dark. What was she going to do with me? I was so sick. And then a little man came, as if from nowhere, and he said to her in Yiddish, the folk language of the Jews of Eastern Europe, "Du bist a Jiddischer Kind? You are a Jewish child? Du bist a Jiddische Tochter? You are a Jewish daughter?" "Yes," my mother asked. "Yes." And he said, "Then come with me and you shall stay in my house." And we went to this poor man's home. It was one room with a dirt floor, heated only by a fireplace where he could cook his meals. His wife gave me her bed and fed me chicken broth. These were righteous people. They had not enough for themselves, but they shared whatever they had with us. When I woke up the next morning, the old man, upon return from his morning prayers, came up to me and said to me, "You are a blessed child, Ruth." I said, "Why? Why?" He said, "Last night, the children's hospital, which was right next to the railroad tracks, was bombed. There are no survivors." We finally made it to my grandparents' house in Justic, one of the lost communities. By the gift of God, my health slowly returned. We stayed in this village from 1939 to 1942, when the Nazis cleansed this Jewish community of all their Jews. Between 1939 and 42, we prayed the Germans would not trouble our little town, but they did. It became a base for their cavalry. Our synagogue became a stable, and the Jews were forced to live in small quarters known as a ghetto. But the Polish farmers in this village were decent Christian people who sold us food, who did us no harm, and some even saved children. And now comes the hardest part. The memories that keep me up at night. 75 years have passed, and yet these events are as clear to me as though they occurred yesterday. In March 1942, on the Jewish holiday of Purim, at dawn, we were awakened by the sound of bullhorns. "Jews to the town square! Schnell, quickly!" We ran to the square. We were separated into 3 groups. Men and strong boys to one group, women and young children to another, and the elderly to a third. They announced that the teenage boys, the strong ones, were needed for work. They tricked us and told us they would be treated well and return home. They herded them onto trucks. My brother Benjamin was dressed in his pants and his pajama top. I ran to the house. I grabbed his jacket. I grabbed a loaf of bread. I ran to the truck. I threw the jacket to him. He caught the jacket. He blew me a kiss. And at that moment, the Nazi who guarded the truck took his rifle, smashed me in the face, broke my nose, knocked my teeth. I collapsed. When I regained consciousness, I heard the wheels of the truck leaving the town, and those young boys were singing the Hatikva, the song of hope, which is today Israel's national anthem. Whenever I hear this song, I see those trucks filled with those young boys on their way to Auschwitz. A month later, the German soldiers swooped down yet again. Their trucks came into town and they grabbed the little children. This time, my little cousins, Devorah and Leah, were amongst them. They were screaming for their mother, "Mama, Mama." My aunt ran out of the house carrying her 2-year-old son, Joshua, who was clinging to her, his arms wrapped around her neck, and he was screaming. My aunt begged, "Take me, let me go with the children." The Nazis took little Joshua from her arms and smashed his head against a wall, no different than this wall, until his brains poured out and he was silenced. I saw this. A week later, on market day, Jewish men with beards and side locks were forced to sit on benches in the town square. The Nazis came in with the trucks, they set up the benches, they forced them in. My grandfather, Betzalel Lobel, was one of those men, and my grandmother, Ruda, was dragged in front of him with a pair of scissors thrust into her hands. She stood there next to grandfather, her husband for 50 years, with whom she had 10 children, and she was ordered to cut off his beard. "No," she said, "Genig, no, enough." A Nazi guard came to her, poked her in the ribs, and said, "Cut his beard, you Jewish whore." Grandfather looked at her and said, No. I pleaded with her, "Cut his beard, grandmother, cut." No. She turned to this Nazi officer and she spit in his face. He took out a pistol. He shot grandmother. He shot grandfather in their head. And minutes later, the Nazis took their machine guns and opened fire on the town of Jostic. "Run, Ruth," my mother said, "run." And I ran as fast as I could. And I ran until I fell in a rain ditch and I passed out. I was 15 years old. When I regained consciousness, it was dark. There was a heavy weight on top of me. I tried to move, but I could not. I heard their boots marching down the road. I heard moans, and then I heard shots fired. I buried my face in the mud, and I passed out. When I woke up, I climbed out of the ditch. I sat on the side of the road and cried. I remembered the instructions of my father. If we were ever separated, go to the house of the Polish farmer who was my friend, his friend, on the outskirts of town. Somehow I found that farmhouse. I walked down that road, stumbling over corpses, not knowing if one of them was my mother or father. I knocked on that farmhouse door. I saw the look of horror on the faces of the farmer and his wife. I was covered in blood. I had been lying under dead bodies. They took me in. They were righteous people. Afterwards, I was returned to what was left of the village. Somehow my mother and father had survived, but not for long. A few days later, the Nazis returned and arrested my father. Minutes before, they pushed him onto a truck to Auschwitz. He placed his hands on my head and in a clear voice recited in Hebrew the traditional priestly blessing. Then he bent down and he kissed me and he quietly said these words to me. I've never forgotten them. "You, my child, shall live. You shall live to tell it all." That was the last time I ever saw my father. Somehow, miraculously, I did live. I posed for the remaining 3 years of the war as a Polish mute Catholic girl. I was shipped back to Germany, and I became a slave laborer for I.G. Farben, the German industrialist giant who made the ammunition for Hitler's armies. And thus, the 16-year-old Jewish girl, Ruth Wagner, became the 16-year-old Polish mute, Wanda Rosinska, who pretended she could not talk. If I had spoken, they would have heard my German accent and realized I was Jewish and would have been killed. After the war, I finally learned what had happened to my family. My mother, Regina, was shot and buried in a mass grave around Hanukkah, 1942. My father, Joshua, and my brother, Benjamin, were murdered in Auschwitz on the day of our highest holiday, Yom Kippur, 1943. My father had tried to organize an escape for the young men of the concentration camp, but someone informed on him. He was hanged as an example, and his son, my brother Benjamin, had to dig his own father's grave and was then shot with him. By the grace of God, I made it to America. I live today in New York, surrounded by the love of my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren. So you could say I am one of the very lucky ones. Time does not permit me to tell you more of my dear mother's story. It is an amazing story, let alone that of my dear late father Irving, who was also a Holocaust survivor. Today, my mother lectures all over New York to young people in the hope that this will never happen again. Yet, man's inhumanity to man is so endless and so deep that we see anti-Semitism, the blind hatred of Jews, all over the world. This is why we so welcome your respected leader, Pastor Chris, and the holy pastors and the guests that are here in our land of Israel. Israel is a symbol of Hitler's failure. I want to present my mother's book, which she inscribed to Pastor Chris, and she asked me, although I am not a daughter of a Kohen, she was. So she asked me to please give him the blessing of the Kohen. May God bless and protect you. May God lift his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. May God show you favor and grant you a life of health, harmony, and a life of peace. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be his will. Amen. This is a picture of my mother, which was used for her identification papers when she was 16 years old. She was posing as a Polish mute.
Regina, we thank you for sharing. I don't have words to say what I want to say about the story. Thank you so much. This place where we are today was carved in the natural petrol